Well, thanks everyone for being here today. Before we start, I'd like to thank Dr. Villanueva and Dr. Barile for assisting for their assistance with organizing this event. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Julianne Newmark, who's Director of Technical and Professional Communication and Assistant Chair for Court Writing at the University of New Mexico, where she teaches, conducts research, and publishes in literary studies and indigenous studies, particularly concerning early 20th century Native American writers. So her 2015 book, The Pluralist Imagination from East to West in American Literature, was published by the University of Nebraska Press. She is also editor-in-chief of Exchanges, which is a writing studies e-journal. Dr. Newmark has a long history of research on D.H. Lawrence's New Mexico period writing, with an additional focus on his Mexican novel, The Plumed Serpent. She has served as an elected officer in the D.H. Lawrence Society of North America for 20 years and has published research on Lawrence in the Arizona Quarterly, the D.H. Lawrence Review, and in 2 book collections, the most recent of which was the 2021, the Edinburgh Companion to D.H. Lawrence and Aesthetic. Thank you for being here, Dr. Newmark.
Thank you, Raúl. Thanks. So thank you for coming. I do want to say a few things before I get started. I would love to learn from you all as well as sharing my insights about Lawrence, because of course I'm not Mexican, and I'm very interested in the interpretation of people who are scholars in Mexico about his work that concerns Mexico. Also, I'm really thankful to Julieta for all of her help, and to Gerardo, my friend, and to Gabriela for answering my panicked WhatsApp messages. So thanks to you all. And this is part of an enterprise of starting to bring attention to the 2025 D.H. Lawrence International Conference, which Julieta and I are on the organizing committee for. And hopefully other people who are part of that organizing committee will also get to come down in the interim and give talks as well. And just sort of we call these trigger warnings in the US. I don't know what you call them down here, but there is some language that Lawrence uses in his work that is very problematic by any day's standards, not just our day's standards. So I am going to read some of that, and I just want people to know that that's coming. Okay, so without further ado, so as I said, this will be about 36 minutes if you're keeping time on your watch. Okay, so in this paper, the new title is United States Nativism and Mexican Indigenismo, Transborder Reactions in and About D.H. Lawrence. So in this paper, I will focus on D.H. Lawrence's Mexico-cited writing, particularly his essays and mornings in Mexico, first published in English in 1927 and translated into Spanish in 1942 by Octavio Barile, and in the novel The Plumed Serpent, first published in English in 1926 and translated into Spanish in 1940 by Carmen Gallardo de Mesa. But I'm going to give more emphasis to the novel. So this essay offers a study of Lawrence's American socio-political proximities, first to the United States political phenomenon known as nativism, and then to the Mexican movement known as indigenismo. Lawrence was beckoned to New Mexico by Mabel Dodge Lujan, who was, in 1922, fighting against a piece of proposed legislation in the United States called the Bursum Bill. This bill was, on its face, about resolving land and water disputes in New Mexico. When you mentioned that you were interested in land, I was like, oh, this is perfect. These disputes revolved around long-existing conflicts between indigenous Pueblo residents, white settlers, and Hispano farmers, many of whom were living on lands granted to them during Spanish colonial rule that became more widely contested during periods of Mexican and then United States control. Yet the subtext of the Bursum Bill the debate was about much more than codifying rights to water and land. The assimilation of indigenous people, the dissolution of tribal lands, and the reimagining of non-indigenous residents as versions of small and Native Americans, legitimate, destined, to a place that was newly admitted to the United States were all elements of this debate too. At the time of strident anti-immigrant and anti-other political nativism, the Bursum Bill seemed to be the latest strategy in rewriting the United States past and future, whereby white Christian American values ascended in an ever-present affirmation of authority, and indigenous pasts and presents were relegated to history, churned under by the mechanism of political maneuvering. Fetishization through tourism, capitalist materialist culture, and overtly assimilationist policies such as land allotment and mandated boarding school education of indigenous children. After traveling and living in New Mexico during this period, Lawrence entered Mexico, a land to which he was not beckoned, per se, as he had been by Mabel Dodge Lujan to New Mexico, but rather because he felt desperate to leave New Mexico and explore whether Mexico was the kind of utopian context he had long sought. I will return to his initial impressions of Mexico shortly, and his comments to those to whom he wrote letters about his reasons for wanting to travel south from New Mexico into Mexico, where he describes the kinds of existential congruities he thought he might experience there. But at the outset of this presentation, I want to establish the cultural dichotomies, well, at least some of them, that existed across the imposed boundary of the US-Mexico border at this time, in the early 1920s. North of the border, the cultural climate of New Mexico can serve as a crystallization of the forces of nativism, as it metamorphosed based on local context, but always aimed to delimit a conception of Americanness that was narrow, not ethnically or religiously diverse, and supported American capitalist privatization and identitarian coherence, despite the very real diversities that existed across the nation. South of the border, as Alan Knight has argued, the work and vision of Manuel Gamio and others established indigenismo as an official, quote-unquote, ideology within the new regime. Knight writes that indigenismo became a mainstream integrationist approach that was, in effect, quote, an elitist, non-Indian construct, and its goals to, quote-unquote, eliminate racism were never achieved. Alexander Dawson, and I know the two scholars on indigenismo who I've just cited are both non-Mexican, so I apologize for that. I know there's a lot of discourse that I could have cited there, but anyway. Alexander Dawson summarizes that after a century of liberal scorn for the Indian, post-revolutionary indigenismo gained prominence as a nationalist endeavor in a society seeking to recreate itself after a decade of civil war, end quote. I won't dive more deeply into definitions of indigenismo here, nor will I articulate its variants, alternatives, and challenges. But I hope this brief invoking of both nativism and indigenismo establishes the transborder construct concerning indigeneity vis-a-vis national peoplehood that figured as the reverberative atmosphere of Lawrence's travels. Lawrence projected onto New Mexico and then onto Mexico his long-held beliefs concerning vast cultural death happenings, his phrase, and how to surmount them via tapping into the quick, which he believed could be kept alive and come through in America. He says, I don't just say USA. He says this in a letter to Gilbert Seldes from the Kiowa Ranch in New Mexico in February 1923. 1 month, and the Kiowa Ranch is near Taos, New Mexico. It's now called the D.H. Lawrence Ranch because Frida Lawrence bequeathed it to the University of New Mexico where I teach. And I actually am teaching a class about the D.H. Lawrence Ranch right now. So if you're curious what that's like, I'm happy to tell you. So 1 month after this letter, Lawrence took these ideas concerning the quick of human vitality and the tension between it and cultural death into Mexico, where he was traveling for the first time. By the time he began writing the novel that would become The Plumed Serpent, begun in 1923, Lawrence was well aware of the imposition of indigenous peoples, imposition upon indigenous peoples of the larger national political ideology, as well as with nativist legislation in New Mexico and post-revolutionary education of the Indian movements in Mexico, such as proposed by Jose Vasconcelos. Indeed, Lawrence attempted to meet Vasconcelos in 1923, though, as David Barnes writes, Lawrence attempts at meeting Vasconcelos, the Minister of Education, to discuss the Indian revival did not come to pass. Quote, the cancellation of their meeting sent Lawrence into a rage, end quote. As Ben Canas-Vibera writes, quote, Lawrence was apparently intrigued by Vasconcelos' attempts to link social transformation to indigenized values, end quote. Barnes explains that, quote, Vasconcelos argued more for racial integration and mixing than for pure nativism. End quote. And in this usage, nativism means pure, as a return to pre-conquest indigenous epistemologies. Whereas in the United States, nativism is perverted to mean, in effect, pure Anglo-Saxonism. And that's what my first book was on, was about these nativist and counter-nativist movements within literary studies and sort of popular rhetorics. It was this pure version, this more indigenous nativism, that integrated indigenismo that was most attractive to Lawrence. A version of return that was, quote, typified by vicarious romanticization of Indian history and culture, as Knight writes, people straight from the pages of The Plumed Serpent, as Knight also writes. So how does Lawrence grapple with those transborder political contexts, as his interest in North American indigeneity persisted an interest that was widely varying from praiseful to nearly viciously critical. I will explain the manifestations in his works of his process of grappling with the context that surrounded him, which he attempted to understand. In David Barnes's words, quote, Mexican indigenismo was developed in the revolutionary years as a way of lending cultural legitimacy to the new institutions that would emerge out of the struggle, end quote. A strategy similar to the encompassing tenor of United States nativism, but with a different source culture. Lawrence read widely about Mexican post-revolutionary theories about the Mexican national people, such as in Gamio's 1926 book, Forjando Patria, which Gamio sent to Lawrence. In addition, Witter Binner, one of Lawrence's traveling companions in Mexico in 1923, noted that Lawrence was also strongly influenced by Lázaro Gutiérrez de Lara and Edgecombe Pinchon's The Mexican People, Their Struggle for Freedom, also published in 1814. These works and others, such as the works of Zelia Nuttall, specifically her fundamental principles of Old and New World civilizations, the influence of which on Lawrence has been examined by L.D. Clark and Daniel Schneider, were deeply considered by Lawrence in the months leading up to his revision of The Plumed Serpent in winter 1924 and 1925. But how does Lawrence integrate this knowledge in his personal experience of Mexico during his months in Mexico? Also pertinent to our readings of Lawrence's Mexican works today, to what effect? Specifically, how do Mexican readers and critics react to Lawrence's representations to his grappling with post-revolutionary indigenismo? I will end this talk with a turn towards these reactions by Mexican critics as a way of calibrating Lawrence's representations with Mexican scholars' own considerations of fictional renderings of post-revolutionary national identity movements, and the lasting legacy of what Lawrence failed to understand, but perhaps tried hard to understand on both sides of the US-Mexico border. Okay, so this first major section is called Leaving Reductive Nativism and Skirting Indigenismo in the Plumed Serpent and Beyond. As I've argued elsewhere, Lawrence's New Mexico and Mexico period writing, taken as an oeuvre, proposes a version of nativity to a place that is flexible, indeed capacious, but yet is continually fraught. Place-based identity formations are always in flux, as they reflect the kind of natural, symbiotic ebb and flow that biospheres exhibit. Racialized visions of a national people, the most well-known vision is nativism in the United States, which of course is very much in the ascendancy currently in the United States, revert and reduce to racial difference in a continually retrogressive quest. And what I mean by that is that the ideal America in the United States case is always in the past, which is why Trump can say, make America great again, as if it was great in the past, but we're not there currently, and so it reflects on a kind of people, a version of the American people that may not look like the one that is the present composition of the national people. So I have long been interested in repudiations of and reactions against nativism by writers who work hard and in some novels truly contort themselves to imagine contexts for alternatives to it, for a different kind of coalescence of national people, when people of various races, religions, genders, and more will necessarily persist in cohabitating as functional national roommates, at least, and family members at best. In the in The Pluralist Imagination, which is my book, I explain what writers who envision alternatives to racialized nativism often attempted to do. They attempted to conceive of new native places. This became the tool by which American counter-nativist writers textually deployed a pluralistic alternative. Against the ascendancy of race-driven logics of Americanness rose the dissenting voices of writers who imagined other ways of describing what the modern American should and must be as the 20th century continued. So in my usage in that book, and everywhere in my work, America is a transborder concept. And Lawrence himself says, as I already read, America, I don't just say USA. But as we apply this concept particularly to the New Mexico borderland, we can study the reaction of Mexican readers to these proposals over decades. From the moment of the publication of the initial Spanish translations of Morning in Mexico and The Plumed Serpent to the present day, when Mexican scholars engaged with representations of Mexico in European and United States modernist literature abound. I will endeavor to speak briefly to this work in the last section of this essay. First, however, I want us to read Lawrence directly. Does Lawrence emerge via his published works in epistolary prose as a theorist, fantasist on the ways in which post-revolutionary states might become contexts for revitalized indigeneity, an on-native soil coalescence of national identity that unifies people across racial boundaries, as perhaps we can interpret his trio of Quetzalcoatl religious leaders in Mexico and the Plumed Serpent is trying to do. It makes sense that scholars across the last 100 years have questioned whether he does or does not do this viably and appropriately, and in the service of what larger vision. One key challenge within Lawrence, with his, in some ways, racially transcendent vision of national wholeness via counter-nativist pluralist proposals, relates to his racial characterizations of people he interacts with during his travels and who he represents in his texts. It is as if his reductions along racial lines are precursory steps to perhaps naive Anglo-centric pluralist vision, which demonstrates a crossing of borders of race, origin, and citizenship that are so often reified in political, academic, and market domains. Yet, do we see Lawrence imagining a kind of cross-cultural unification which he envisions as the only way a national people might integrate a complex and violent past with a future vulnerable to the fracturing forces of industrial modernity? For readers, Lawrence poses significant critical challenges, which explain the extensive roster of analysts who have discussed the racial dimensions of his work. But my eventual focus here will be on a particular population of readers, indeed the Mexican people as described by Lawrence himself. But it is worthwhile to present clearly Lawrence's attitudes about Mexico and its people soon after his arrival on Mexican soil. What Lawrence writes to his mother-in-law in May 1923, after having been in Mexico for 2 months and settling on Lake Chapala, reveals his initial assessment of the Mexican people. And here he contrasts Mexican people with New Mexico Pueblo peoples, and against white Americans and Europeans who he codes as we in this passage. He writes, Mexico is very interesting, a foreign people. They are mostly pure Indians, dark like the people of Ceylon, but much stronger. The men have the strongest backbones in the world, I believe. They are half civilized, half wild. If they only had a new faith, they might be new, young, beautiful people. But as Christians, they don't get any further, are melancholy inside, live without hope, and are suddenly wicked and don't like to work. But they are also good, can be gentle and honest, are very quiet, and are not at all greedy for money, and to me that is marvelous. They care so little for possessions, here in America where the whites care for nothing else. But not the peon. He has not his fever to possess that is a real Weltschmerz, those of you who speak German can correct me, possess that is a real Weltschmerz with us. And that's where he uses us to create this family relationship with him and his mother-in-law who was German. Lawrence's attribution of human cultural decay to adherence to Christianity is well documented and is evident throughout his career. In the above passage, as he does in his rendering of New Mexico Pueblo tribes, and I wish I could read some contrasting passages to show how he describes people from Taos Pueblo, but I don't have time today. He identifies Christianity as a force sometimes desiccating, sometimes ballast-like. As tied to nativist renderings of national peoplehood, Lawrence recognizes that overlaid Christianity, which presupposes a Eurocentric nativity that is definitional within nativism, is not just exclusionary, but also engenders cultural paralysis. Interestingly, at the same time, Lawrence was proceeding with composition of his Mexican novel, Quetzalcoatl, as he wished to call it, though he later revised the novel and was encouraged to retitle it The Plumed Serpent. He writes to John Middleton Murray a few weeks before the above letter to share that, I wanted to do a novel. I sort of wanted to do a novel here. I could never begin in Mexico City, but I have begun here in Chapala. I am having the first slight scene of my novel, the beginning of a bullfight in Mexico City, end quote. Lawrence indicates a vision of transborder modernity as defined by Christopher Shedler, who identifies border modernists as a group in which he includes Lawrence that, quote, searches for an alternative to the aesthetic of metropolitan modernism, a search that is in itself a post-colonial act. I mean, we could explore whether we agree with that or not, but Lawrence's statement that he could not begin in Mexico City figures as evidence on top of his rural residence on a remote ranch outside of Taos, New Mexico over the winter of 22-23, and again for several months in 1924, that it was decidedly a place issue that was responsible for his ability or inability to create narratives that envisioned alternative models of national identity and place-based belonging. Lawrence's concept of spirit of place, a theme so frequently revisited throughout his career, has been extensively examined by Lawrence scholars. But with regard to Mexico, L.D. Clark, and he's also the Cambridge editor of The Plumed Serpent. He's no longer alive, but he was very well known in this particular area of Lawrence studies. So L.D. Clark crystallizes the stakes and the ambition, he writes. The spirit of Mexico, like that of New Mexico, had long taken time to work its complete magic on Lawrence. For the second time now, the American Southwest had served as a threshold to what must be the ultimate meeting ground between Lawrence's spirit and that of the continent, the most Indian of North American places, Mexico, end quote. While the construct of the most Indian of North American places needs pushing against, that's L.D. Clark's phrase, as it is a primitivistic projection and a convenient mapping of post-revolutionary struggle onto realities concerning indigenous status in a coalesced nation state on both sides of the border, what Clark conveys here is that for Lawrence, Mexico is a place, quote, of fear as well as of deep awe, end quote. To further complicate a statement that avers Lawrence's cross-border conception of indigeneity, it is worth noting that for Lawrence, there were unities and stark differences between indigenous peoples north and south of the US-Mexico border. But the ways in which he configured both populations results from his own projections onto them and his understandings of the ways in which these populations have resisted to, been indifferent to, or succumbed to the colonizing forces of Christianity, modernity, and settler politics, or rejection thereof. In writing about global indigenous studies today, Jody Bird explains that, quote, one of the many challenges currently facing indigenous studies is finding commonalities across the diverse regions and histories brought together under the rubric of indigeneity. For often it is the shared experience of dispossession, colonization, and violence that unfortunately link indigenous people's struggles globally, more than some sense of shared aesthetic, cultural, or political ideas or values, end quote. 100 years ago, Lawrence did perceive the commonalities Bird laments as existing as a kind of common vocabulary. Furthering this sense of common experience across contexts were representational works such as Lawrence's, which became well known by writers who described or misrepresented the lives of Native people they encountered, as Lawrence did in New Mexico and Mexico. And Lawrence himself did not shy away from drawing parallels or identifying differences vis-a-vis different populations' reactions to the forceful impacts of European colonialism. So now we'll loop back to Lawrence's initial descriptions of Mexican people, which he used as a shorthand for indigenous, and by which he means people who are native to Mexico and are not entirely, through cultural habits or heritage, European, as he saw it. And again, from his letter to his mother-in-law, he described Mexican people as, in his words, half civilized, half wild, strong, dark, foreign. We see Lawrence experimenting with these character features as he saw them in a much expanded description in the Plumed Serpent's bullfight scene that he was composing at the same time, based on a visit to a bullfight in Mexico City soon after he arrived. The published version of this scene, as published in 1926, introduces one of the novel's central characters, the future religious leader and cipher for the Aztec war god Huitzilopochtli, forgive me if I mispronounced that, General Cipriano Viedma, who he meets when he meets the female Irish protagonist Kate Leslie in the stadium tunnel. Yet even as Lawrence strives for further character illumination, does he veer far from his initial epistolary summary. As Douglas Beach has written, quote, Lawrence left no travel journal, but what he said in other contexts, such as in letters like the one noted above to his mother-in-law, and essays, notably the essay Au revoir, USA, the only one composed during his visit to Mexico were, quote, they found their way with little to no alteration into the compendious novel, which is the Plumed Serpent. Cipriano enters the novel thus, quote, a little officer in uniform wearing a big blue cape made his way through the crowd. He was short, dark, and had a little black beard like an imperial. He came through the people from the inner entrance and cleared his way with a quiet, silent unobtrusiveness, yet with the peculiar, heavy Indian movement, end quote. Lawrence maintains his initial assessment of a kind of authoritative Mexican national indigeneity channeled through Cipriano as its embodiment. Actually, can you click ahead there? Just go back to the, yeah. So this is the first edition cover of the Plumed Serpent, the English language first cover, and this is the initial cover of Mornings in Mexico. And we could do a whole lot of visual rhetorical analysis on these choices, but we don't have time for that here. And So, and then if you just want to click to the next one, this is Lawrence visiting Teotihuacan, and you can, there's a few other photos here that we'll get to in a minute, but I just wanted you to have some visual interest as well. So Lawrence maintains his initial assessment of a kind of authoritative Mexican national indigeneity, channeled through Cipriano as its embodiment. Cipriano introduces himself to Kate, who had been trying to leave the stadium, while attempting to keep her distance from a crowd she found fear-inducing. He describes her thus: her face had that drawn, blank look of a woman near hysterics, end quote. Cipriano says, "I am General Viedma. Do you wish to leave? Let me get you an automobile," he said in very English that sounded strange from his dark face and a little stiff on his soft tongue. His eyes were dark, quick, with the glassy darkness that she found so wearying, but they were tilted up with a curious slant under arched black brows. It gave him an odd look of detachment, as if he looked at life with raised brows. His manner was superficially assured, underneath perhaps half-savage, shy, farouche, and deprecating. So this is Lawrence's introduction of a character who, through his eventual occupation of the role of Huitzilopochtli, has been described by Sheila Marie Contreras as, quote, ever a god of war and blood sacrifice, thereby serving as, quote, a transparent commentary on Cipriano's blood point. Biologically, he is more Indian than any of the other characters in the novel, and therefore closer both historically and temperamentally in Lawrence's understanding to ancient Mesoamerican ritual violence, end quote. However, by describing Cipriano as, quote, looking at life with raised brows, Lawrence indicates Cipriano's circumspection, his suspicion even, of the moving forces of Mexican political conflict and purported revitalization, which happens later in the novel, that surround him and in which he plays a role, first as a military general and later as a god embodiment. All of this work, then, may indicate, as Phyllis Theory Stanton has argued, that, quote, Lawrence was primarily concerned with rendering a primitive that could substantiate his own redemptive ideas for Western civilization, end quote. Thus, he creates variations on an archetype, rehearsing across multiple attempts by Cipriano, for example, or in his descriptions in the Mornings in Mexico essay, Huachihuayapa, of Rosalino, who is a, quote, mountain boy, an Indian from a village 2 days' walk away, possessing black, visionless eyes and a voice that resonates with, quote, aloofness touched with resignation. Deary Stanton argues that Lawrence's portrayals of indigenous people of the Americas should not only be scrutinized for their accuracy, they are of course inaccurate, but more for how their presence in his works affords his reader, quote, a better understanding of the function that native cultures and peoples have played as sign and symbol to the European Lawrence. Of course, this is necessarily problematic. Excuse me. Lawrence's portrayals cannot be assessed for accuracy. However, to Deary Stanton's second point, these presentations can certainly be read to reveal Lawrence's transborder concept of cultural travel and transmission in his simplified pan-Indianism. Yet what is more important, for me at least, is connecting Lawrence's place-based counter-nativist pluralist vision of nation building to the impact of his writings about Mexico on Mexican writers and critics in the years since his Mexico period works were published. These responses can tell us a lot about the viability of counter-nativist, by which I mean place-based plural national peoples, the literary philosophies that Lawrence might deploy or imagine as transborder, but might not operate analogously north and south of that imposed border. If Lawrence was working against reductive paradigms of national identity, such as those dubbed nativist in the United States, and if the emergent movement of indigenismo was compelling to Lawrence, then does he propose a kind of pluralism that is not reducible to race in the plumed serpent? A national peoplehood that is ultimately catalyzed by place-based relationships, not race-based ones? An indigenismo that perhaps all can embrace as a diverse national people? Certainly he does seem to do a lot of reducing to race in descriptions of individuals and groups of people. Over the years, I have identified in a range of turn-of-the-century, early 20th century American, United States writers who resisted the multiple and simultaneous confines of political nativism. And I've argued concerning Lawrence in this context that he imagines a transcendent peoplehood where racial differences, stereotypes, and prejudices likely persist, but in which place-centered possibilities for new national identities might even progress beyond the anthropocentric. I wrote about it as follows, in signaling what the Quetzalcoatl religion signifies at the conclusion of the novel, with Kate, Don Ramon, Lawrence as Quetzalcoatl embodiment, and Cipriano as its figureheads. Lawrence pivots to the mytho-religious human political figure. Ramon is Quetzalcoatl to the historical mythology of the serpent bird. And Lawrence says, or writes, Quetzalcoatl, woven through and associated with this actually this is my words, I'm sorry. Quetzalcoatl, woven through and associated with this aracial, ahistorical, apolitical, and genderless tree, has become the quintessence of a new kind of native. Quetzalcoatl belongs in, is native to, without question, the place where the tree grows and in the tree itself, but is not fused with or melted into the tree. Lawrence is insistent on the serpent bird as the symbol of the culmination of a movement that could have been dominated by individual race, class, geopolitical, or historical forces, reminds his reader of the power of the plural and its capacity for enabling balance. Through the serpent bird and its tree, Lawrence offers a new model of nationhood that transgresses long-held conventions and the reliance on assimilation and unilateralism. So, place-based relationships then figure as textual counterweights to racialized nativistic proposals concerning national peoplehood in Mexico. That is the argument that I'm putting forward here, although I'll just say it's really interesting. I've written about the plumed serpent many times over the last 20 years. I wrote my master's thesis on the plumed serpent, and then I have a chapter in my book, which is now like 8 years old, it's partially on the plumed serpent. But reading those materials again now, I mean, we all change the way we read things over time. And I think vis-a-vis the concept of indigenismo, a lot becomes kind of uncovered or unlocked through the discourse around those two different national identity paradigms. So that's really what I'm hoping to tap into later. But anyway, so if you want to click to the next slide here. Here's Lawrence again, touring around. That's his wife, Frida, and him on the left, Frida on the right, and Witterbinner, his friend, in the middle. So scholars continue to comment on Lawrence's representations in the plumed serpent. For one, because they are widely read, participated in a spate of representational writing, and were inconclusive and unresolvably complex. And I guess people are still reading them when they go to hotels in Oaxaca, as you were saying. But also the novel's power, despite being criticized as being poorly wrought and indecisive, may relate to, in Ben Canas-Biber's words, its, quote, inventing of a counterfactual history of the Mexican Revolution, wherein a placial reterritorialization occurs when vanguard intellectuals, both Ramon and Cipriano, occupy the territory of the Mexican subaltern's messianic impulse. Yet, Lawrence makes sure to still, quote, leave a space in which the trace of different kinds of subaltern activity can be read. This book by Ben Canas-Biber, it came out a couple years ago. It's a really interesting book about vanguard intellectualism in various places in the world. And he has a chapter on the plumed serpent, which is actually really out of context with the other chapters in the book. But it's really pretty interesting stuff. So Bear's noting of the existence of traces of and unresolvable threads in the novel relates to my claim that the novel at the same time attempts to move away and refuses to move away from the racialization of the subaltern, Mexican indigenous people in this case. And all the while stages a new multiracial religion that will catalyze a Mexican national, political, and cultural renaissance in a site-specific fashion, a manner that is impossible to dislocate. So you can, us literary critics, we love to smush words together in unique ways. So speaking of localization, I want to turn in the final section to localized in situ response to the novel. So this last section is called In Situ Responses to Lawrence's Mexican Imaginary and Imagined Mexico. So if we want to click to the next one. Okay, so Octavio Paz, and again, this is the section in which I'm going to read to all of you fluent Spanish speakers in Spanish, so please don't laugh at me. I'm going to do my best. So Octavio Paz, famed Mexican writer and diplomat, was a celebrant of Lawrence and was clear about the impacts Lawrence had on him, not just as a result of the profundity of an expurgated 1934 edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover that Paz read with entusiasmo o más exactamente con esa pasión ávida y encarnizada que solo se tiene en la juventud. But also because of the perceptiveness, Paz thought, of Lawrence's writing about Mexico. In a special edition of Paz's magazine Vuelta, you see the cover here, published in 1991, Paz and others expressed their appreciation for Lawrence in the Celebración de D.H. Lawrence issue, which also featured André Malraux, Gabriel Marcel, Anthony Stanton, and Fernando Garcia Ramirez in Paz's essay. Principally on Chatterley, Paz foregrounds the reasons why Lawrence was a particularly astute, in his mind, commentator on Mexico. Interestingly, as Paz opens his essay, he emphasizes the sensory attunement of Lawrence to Paz's country, to Mexico as a sensory experience. Indeed, this indicates that for Paz, Lawrence had understood Mexico's spirit, such a key concept throughout Lawrence's work. Paz does not mention the Mexican people at all here. However, despite the fact that this is how Lawrence's own writing about Mexico began, Paz writes that what most impacted him were works that Lawrence had written about Mexico wherein Lawrence vio, oyó, tocó, olió, y en una palabra sintió la tierra mexicana con sus montañas, pedregales, sus lagos, sus forfateras, sus nubes enormes y sus grandes lluvias. Paz remarks that Lawrence was able to express the mythic spirit of Mexico, adivinó y recreó la dimensión mítica del paisaje mexicano and its supernatural power. In Paz's appreciation of Lawrence, he dwells upon the sublime, the poetic, and attributes to Lawrence a special gift, one that even eludes Mexican writers. Quote, logró lo que otras novelistas mexicanos y extranjeros no han conseguido, convertir a los árboles y las flores, los montes y los lagos, los serpientes y los pájaros de México en presencias. A direct evocation of Lawrence's novel, named for the mythical fusion of these figures, made present, indeed, as resurrections of a dormant mythology. Lawrence was able to make present the geographic, topographical, and animal realities of Mexico, and to Paz, this was the mark of the poet-priest, poeta sacerdote, that Lawrence was, a writer who was able to do something religious figures and anthropologists who study primitive societies could not do. And Paz uses primitive societies, that's not my wording. El diario comienzo es el primer día de que, cada día, inventen los amantes un comienzo sin fechas. In Lawrence's Mexico, conveyed via the plumed serpent and moorings in Mexico, Paz believed that Lawrence behaved as a lover does, each day existing in an atemporal promise to begin anew, daily beginnings ad infinitum. That Paz in the early 1990s reflected on the sublimity of Lawrence rather than on his racial objectifications, social dynamic representations, or political perspectives and recastings, compels us to ask more questions about Paz's politics as they evolved and as they became manifest in his years as a Mexican public intellectual. For now, though, Priscilla Dorela's words will add a brief problematization. She writes, Paz believed that the only state able to establish conditions for peaceful coexistence was the democratic republican state, since it has a duty to guarantee critical and pluralistic freedom of expression. The problem of revolutionary movements would then be that they enabled the creation of authoritarian and violent states in the name of peace, as Paz expressed in his 1984 essay, El Diálogo y el Ruido. So given this verbiage, it is interesting that a novel like The Plumed Serpent was so celebrated by Paz, but perhaps in it he deciphered a degree of pluralism. I mean, because it is very authoritarian and violent, if you've read it. But it also does contain this degree of pluralism against racial nativism, and the novel allows space for this, though it is an unstable space. Paz did proclaim how regrettable it was that no Mexican critics by 1991, and that's not exactly true because there were people writing about Lawrence before that, had duly analyzed Lawrence's Mexican period works. Paz writes, es curioso, por decir lamentable, que ningún crítico nuestro haya dedicado un estudio serio a la producción mexicana de Lawrence. La serpiente inflamada es un libro disparatoada y entrañable. Mañanas de México vale más que cualquier tratado de psicología de varios de los himnos y poemas que esmaltan. La palabra es justa. Su gran fracasada novela está entre lo mayor de su poesía. Though Paz deemed the plumed serpent failed, he believed that the mythic dimensions of Lawrence's Mexican work deserved concerted study by Mexican scholars, and I would assume, given Paz's long and complex political history, an exploration of the disconnections and connections between the Mexico represented in Lawrence's work and the realities of revolutionary and post-revolutionary Mexico would have been seen as worthy. Significantly, since the 1990s, many Mexican scholars have written about Lawrence and not about textual mythologies, geographies, and poetics. Armando Pereira, do any of you know Armando Pereira?
Sí.
Sí. Yo no puedo comprar sus libros en los Estados Unidos, but he's written on Lawrence, and I can't access those works myself, so maybe while I'm here, I'll be able to. But so Armando Pereira argued in 2013 and 2017, and I did email him about a year and a half ago, and he did write me back, but that Lawrence traveled to Mexico as part of a personal quest, as an extension of his other travels that sought a utopian context. In Mexico, however, the only utopia he was able to approximate was in the domain of the text. And that utopian vision is potentially torn asunder by three principal but tenuously connected figureheads of the Quetzalcoatl religion. Pereira writes that Lawrence's illusions did not le permitió ver el México real y lo que sucedía en él. Toda esa serie de circunstancias sociales, políticas, económicas que harían imposible la construcción de su utopía. This assessment connects to that of Emmanuel Carballo, who in 1970 wrote that México solo fue en la vida y en la obra de Lawrence un pretexto de evasión y búsqueda. Carballo continues with a firm review that Lawrence's trips to Mexico were excusas de un hombre iluminado se da a sí mismo para buscar en un país que él considera primitivo argumentos que comprueban sus tesis acerca del triunfo de la sangre sobre la razón, de los instintos sobre la inteligencia y del sexo sobre la enajenación. Lawrence did not find his lost paradise in Mexico, and according to Carballo, was exasperated and full of hatred as a result, which are revealed as the resounding sentiments as the novel approaches its denouement. Tomás Bernal Alanís, does anybody know him? He is a professor here in Mexico City, somewhere. We talked about him on a Zoom call. Anyway, he's currently writing about Lawrence. But in a 2008 essay, he focuses on the dualities that Mexico represented for Lawrence. In The Plumed Serpent, Lawrence was never able to get away from una mirada dualista sobre México y su historia. Lawrence presents a culture in the novel descarada por sus contradicciones y en busca de una respuesta a la crisis occidental de Europa. Lawrence se sumerge en las aguas profundas de la historia de México para encontrar las antiguas fuerzas de la naturaleza. Bernal Alanís does contend that in the novel, the cost of the return of Quetzalcoatl is high. Las huellas religiosas, el problema agrario, el caudillismo, la educación rural solo son algunos de los ingredientes de esta tragicomida en tierras mexicanas. For Bernal Alanís, what Lawrence does do is allow the serpent bird of the novel's title to exist again in the present, a reiteration of an idea Paz used, of every day being created anew, timelessly. Because of this, and I paraphrase Bernal Alanís here, Lawrence was able to offer something few non-Mexican writers brought forth, which was the presence of modern Mexico in this world, in this time, not consigned to a misty, irretrievable past. So, let's see, I think maybe I have one more slide here. Oh, and I am in my last paragraph. So, I have quickly examined just a small selection of responses to Lawrence's Mexico period writing, most from the post-1970 period, though there were commentaries on Lawrence's actual presence in Mexico during his time here, like newspaper reports. But others have cataloged Spanish language responses, so not only Mexican responses, pre-1989. The most comprehensive article is D.H. Lawrence in Spanish, a checklist of works by and about him by Ángeles de la Concha, and she was a professor in Spain. Since this time, many articles have emerged from Mexican scholars, such as those mentioned here, as well as by public intellectuals, writers, and commentators, such as Tanya Huntington, her recent 2021 Literal Online magazine article, La Mexicanidad según D.H. Lawrence, and Gerardo Piñas, Quiero invité a las 5 en punto, The Plume Serpent de D.H. Lawrence, of 2013. Enrique Krauss has considered Lawrence within the last decade in the article British Writers on Mexico's Night of Violence and Day of Magical Attraction. By examining such responses to Lawrence's Mexico period writing, I hope we might engage certain transborder theories. My connections to indigenismo and nativism are such engagements, and turn our focus to Mexican in situ responses, work that I have merely but suggested here. Perhaps such critical work will support an understanding of Lawrence's approach, the kind of religio-political theory that his texts offer relative to a larger climate of revolution, migration and immigration, and protectionism and coexisting reactions to these, ranging from nativism north of the border to indigenismo south of it. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I would love to, or ideas that you would like to share with me.
But the issue of this kind of national paradigm was not indigenismo, it was mestizaje. And that's what he didn't get at all.
I think it seems that he was trying to represent at the same time something plural, which would be a mestizaje kind of concept, right? And something like absolutely racially sort of pure. And these two ideas were combating each other in his work. Because he was, if you've read Lawrence's work, you know that he's very attracted to dualistic paradigms, like between men and women, and it's always this vying for power between a man and a woman, or between authoritarian regimes and ones that are more sort of democratically configured, or between Christianity or a more mythological pre-Christian religiosity. And I think, frankly, he was very confused when he came to Mexico. And so what he represented in his novel was like a perverted version of something that wasn't happening in Mexico at the time. And that's why in Craig Baer's book, he calls it a counterfactual post-revolutionary Mexico, that it doesn't look like what was happening in the Mexico when he was actually here, but it was an imagined version of what could have happened. So, since he clearly misunderstood Mexico in the early 1920s, I guess my question would be to you all and other scholars, what do we do with a book like The Plume Serpent? Does it become useless to us? And I think it could well be. Although, there's still a lot of people in British and American literary studies who are really interested in his work. So because of that, I do think we need to have critical responses that problematize him and his travels and his engagements, whether they're in Mexico, whether they're in New Mexico, whether they're in Australia, whether they're in Italy. So I think that finding ways to really contextualize his work is important for us to do now. So what do you think?
Well, I would paraphrase what Achebe said of Conrad. He's a bloody racist and sexist.
And I wouldn't disagree with that. We were talking about that a little bit before we came in here. And I was explaining to Gabriela that I work in Indigenous studies in the United States, and his representations of the Apache peoples and of Taos Pueblo peoples are very difficult to read today. However, people from Indigenous communities themselves, like Phil Deloria, who's a very eminent Dakota scholar in the United States, he talks about D.H. Lawrence and his work in a way that doesn't actually completely tear him apart, but sort of looks at Lawrence in the context of movements in the 1920s in the United States to try to, as I mentioned in this essay, grapple with things like the Burson Bill, which I mentioned early in the essay, which is an actual piece of legislation that would have had horribly deleterious effects on Pueblo people's rights to their land and water. So he used his fame to write an article against this bill, which was published in the New York Times Literary Supplement. And he says in that essay, he's like, what do I know about Pueblo Indians, he said. He says that almost as like, I need to get it out of the way for my readers that I don't know much, but he does establish throughout that essay that what the attempts to deny them rights to their land and water would do is basically dissolve tribal relations. So on that issue, he comes out on the side of indigenous people. So if we look at, I mean, to your point, you know, we can't deny that the things that he writes are horribly racist. But in his time, he did function on the side of trying to agitate against legislation that would have been really harmful. And he believed that he was trying to understand something that he thought other people didn't understand very well, other Euro-American writers. He thought that. So there's this one passage from an essay that he wrote. It was the first essay, one of the first essays he wrote when he got to New Mexico. And he talks about going to see a dance, at a tribal dance at the Apache Nation, Mescalero Apache. And he talks about all of these tourists who are crowding around this dance. And he describes this American girl with her camera. And she gets in trouble with the tribal, not police, but the tribal people who are managing this event. And this tourist is told that she cannot have her camera, that she has to get rid of her camera or get rid of the film. And Lawrence describes that situation as if he's somehow more enlightened than that American girl with the camera. And the question is, was he really, or was he just a tourist like all these other tourists who didn't understand where he was going? I'll tell you though, in Lawrence circles, Laurentians generally do not like Lawrence to be described as a travel writer or a tourist. But I think it's an open question for sure. And when people put books like The Plumed Serpent in hotels that are popular with tourists, even today I think that reinforces that for some he's seen as a travel writer. So, but I mean, I really want to probe that question more to piggyback on my question of you, which is reading The Plumed Serpent worthless today? Should we not even bother reading it? I don't know.
Well, there are so many things interesting to read.
Mm-hmm.
And among his contemporaries, Lowry, which is a huge writer,
Yeah.
compared to Lawrence is just pathetic.
Oh, I like that. Okay, yes.
No, I think that, the visions of Lawrence compared to the people who were writing at the same time in Mexico, about Mexico, or in England, about Britain, is very interesting because he moves away from the main positions. And I think that's interesting. And perhaps there are things in him nowadays that can coincide with visions of communities in the Mexican Indian community. I think that's a way of reading him again. No?
I do think though, like, it's very tricky, and again, I'm not a scholar here in Mexico. I think there would be some very important questions to ask if you were going to have a group of students read like The Plumed Serpent or Mornings in Mexico. Would you ever do it? If you did it, how would you set it up? What would you read them alongside his contemporaries who were also coming from Britain, who had traveled a lot and sort of in a comparative fashion, examine their interpretations? I mean, I find what Paz said to be a really sort of interesting but problematic workaround, in that he focuses on Lawrence's poetics. Like, exclusively in that essay, he almost like excuses him for all of the other things he didn't get right. But he focuses on like the beauty of his writing. So although I don't think you can really do that, especially not within like a cultural studies kind of standpoint. But I mean, I would be very curious to see how you all would, or if you would, teach that work.
Well, in fact, he belongs to a very long tradition of writing about Mexico, and not just that period that is quite famous.
Right.
Even Haggard came to Mexico. He's following also the footsteps of Prescott, the historian, and he can be read now among, I mean, with the perspective of colonial writing,
Right.
because he writes exactly the same of what was being said about Indians, Africans. You can read it through post-colonial eyes with questions of mimicry. But even so, it is inadmissible. And that's the problem with that whole generation, except Larry, in a way.
Yeah. But even though dating back earlier, you know, you have people as part of like Spanish colonial missions coming and representing what it is that they saw when they arrived. And again, I'm not an expert in that area, but I mean, this is perhaps a continuation of these like European fantasies about Mexican indigenous culture. And how Lawrence fits into that kind of genealogy is, I mean, to me, since I have mostly historically focused on his New Mexico writing, and his existence as this part of this milieu of modernist writers in New Mexico at the time, and many of them were actually involved in indigenous politics alongside Pueblo peoples. It's been really interesting to situate him in that way. But I do really wonder, I mean, this will be really interesting, Julieta, when we have a conference in 2025, for people who think that it's like inexcusable and basically a sort of a waste of pedagogical space to dedicate time to Lawrence when there are many others who might be read in a more productive fashion. So I think it's going to be
I mean, it's important for the students to know what happened and the kind of vision, now that this kind of image has been recognized to be part of an overall racism all over the world, no? And that the representation is the basis for other kinds of dispossession. You can read it.
Yeah.
I usually exemplify some things so that they know, but it's a waste of time to read the whole thing, because then you get other kind of critical work, like a man called Howe, saying that, okay, to have a human sacrifice might be an exaggeration, but then if you are in Mexico, it is quite possible to have human sacrifices. And to write that in the 60s, it's an aberration.
I think your point is an important one. Like the plumed serpent, as I mentioned, has been widely regarded as a failure. You know, not Lawrence's best work, not his best novel. So reading the whole thing probably would be a waste of people's time. I mean, I read the whole thing, I wrote my master's thesis on it, but you could get enough of that kind of theme from shorter works, like some of his essays from Mornings in Mexico. You could do enough if you were doing like a survey, and that would be enough, I think. But it was really interesting to me that people are still writing about this.
Yeah, and I was talking to Julie like a while ago, no? And I was telling her about like this concern about reading or not reading Lawrence or whatever, and I was telling her about an experience at an Airbnb, no, in Oaxaca, no, where we got there, and amongst the travel guides, no, that we found to Mexico, there was the plumed serpent, no, the plumed serpent, no, by Lawrence, no. So you think that we're past that point, but my question is, how much are we really past that point, no? Especially when it comes to other people looking at Mexico, and also Mexicans looking at Mexico, no? Like many of the Mexican writers talking along the lines of like mestizaje are really working towards the erasure of Indian peoples, no? Like there's also this other program, and I do think that that paying attention to those moments when these discussions are opening up, like for example, none of the many of including past, none of them are past the a very strong racism, no? And I do think that, or for example, which is this other Bruno Traven, no? For example,
I work with all these writers, the German ones. We're just publishing the second book on these German travelers, and I'm just revising the foreword and all this, and we discuss that kind of thing and the issues of the categories of racism, what racism is, and in our German writers. And you have all this, and you have all different perspectives. And I've written about Traven as well, and I just published a book, an article about the representation of women in some of these writers, no? And so, and the issue of stereotypes, no?
Yeah.
That is, there's another thing there. But what I see, from the discussion and from the very interesting points is that you have these books, these travel books, no? And my writers are actually, they are travel writers, no? Including some of the work I work with Traven, no? And you see how they represent, the Indians. What is the Indian? What is race? What is a mestizo? What is the role of the white people in Mexico as well as at the time, and the difference between class and race, and sometimes all this, and then my point of view, and when I'm working with this material, is that it's there, as you said, and people, are reading this, and then it's as Julie said, we need to have this kind of critical recognition of, thinking of why that happened, and all you mentioned the critical, the cultural studies approach. I think this is a major point, and as well the political issue about nationhood through these different things, and so there's lots of things that we can consider, not just kind of say, no, this is just racism and sexism. Because it is, and it's very offensive. It's extremely offensive. Some of the writers I'm working with in German, they're extremely offensive, but they have, the way they build the arguments sometimes, then you understand why. And this understanding is really enriching, that you get to say, oh yeah, this is why this is happening. No? And probably we cannot understand everything, but it's kind of say, oh yeah, so, and then they are following this politics, or they are against this other politics, no? And this is really, when we have then a group of students, and then you select probably not from Serpent, but specific essays. So, and then having the chance of discussing this, I think it's just really intellectually fruitful. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Not that just saying, this is something that is not worth it. And because you find those books, that people are still reading those books, and these stereotypes are alive, no? And we have even, politics today. Yeah, you're Indian, you're white. No, we have all, we live that now. This is something we live still here. Now, so we actually, it's part of what we are still now. So I don't know. So my point was that it's very. This is why when we got in touch with the society, and I became part of it. I said, yeah, it's something that it needs to be done, basically, and to open the chance of having this discussion.
And I think you and I have talked about this along with the other people in the society who are part of organizing this conference. I think it is long overdue that there was a stronger Mexican or Central South American sort of presence in the society, not just the Lawrence Society, but maybe in other societies as well. Lawrence, I've been an officer for 20 years, but because Lawrence has become this sort of what's the word I'm looking for? He has gotten recognition for being somebody who represented Mexico. Like in the case of, representing sort of Mesoamerican mythologies or whatever. But it would be important that Mexican scholars were part of these, and which they have, which I was trying to establish in this paper, that there is a long tradition of Mexican scholars writing about Lawrence. However, English language scholars were unaware of that. And I think that is a problem. That there was a lot of discourse about Lawrence dating back to the 1930s. But for very few articles that have been written in English on Lawrence to recognize those scholarly works, I think that is a problem. I mean, it's a language problem, a translation problem, that many of those haven't been translated into English, so people who don't read Spanish can't, integrate that content. But I felt that it was very important to try to, build relationships like ours. We collaborate on this. So, anyway.
Do we know, so you mentioned, you use the term transborder modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And to build on Dr. Nair's question, this is something that is useful, to contextualize Vasconcelos. Because, Vasconcelos imagined, the cosmic race or Mestizaje or whatever as this ideal modern Mexican race which would lead the country through, the future, and beyond. And so is Lawrence engaging Vasconcelos in a similar way, or do we know?
Well, we know a little bit about that, and I must confess, I do need to learn more about that, like how much information there is on his reaction to Vasconcelos. But from what I understand, he thought that sort of the mestizaje, like very integrative, pluralistic visions, were taking things too far because he believed more in racial essentialism.
Right.
Actually,
Right.
that which is very problematic. So it was more of a indigenous than an Indianismo kind of movement. Whereas, like from what I've read, Indigenismo was a vision where, maybe you guys can educate me on this, where the sort of Mexican public education system integrated these common roots and almost a shared indigenous past, so the post-revolutionary Mexican people could all sort of cleave to this common narrative of where the people came from.
Right.
Okay. And Lawrence, in the novel, I don't think he ever really works out something quite as fundamentally integrative as that vision that integrates across race, gender, and class lines, which was, from how I understand it, how that vision was supposed to work across Mexico.
It was a very new thing.
Yeah, it was very new.
Modern Mexican myth, country after revolution myths, a national myth, and so that was very useful.
Right, and that's why I think it's so interesting to position it against nativism in the United States, which was happening at the same time, which was backward-looking also, but in a very different way. It was looking backwards to this sort of mythical Anglo-European nativity, which never really existed. But it was there's all different kinds of versions of it, but in some versions, indigenous North American peoples, because they can be safely just deemed, consigned to antiquity, their traditions could be appropriated and made a part of this common Euro-American national story. And you see movements like the Boy Scouts of America picking up some of these tropes where they use a lot of indigenous iconography, but it is slapped on top of white American boyhood. So, and I mean, Charles Alexander Eastman, the first Native American medical doctor, was involved in early versions of Boy Scouts of America, and his book, Indian Boyhood, was used within the Boy Scouts. So there are some at this exact same time in history. So, but the United States version of looking backward to come up with a cohesive national story that will help the United States grapple with the biggest immigration surges they'd ever seen in 1917, and dealing with like post-world, like interwar, well they didn't know that at the time, but post-World War I, like national identity conflicts, was to say, we're going to come up with a story that is sort of sterilized, sort of versions of assimilation, where race gets flattened out. But of course, it never got flattened out.
Right.
It could never get flattened out because, especially,
it
was quite the opposite. It was reified. So for people who were living an experience where race for them could never be erased, they were like, what are my alternatives?
Right.
So in my book, I talk about how for many of those people, they, and it was very kind of mixed populations. Like New Mexico is kind of this interesting place where it has a long Hispanic history, a long indigenous history, and a long history of white settlement, where people came together in this like newly formed state within the United States and said, well, we belong as American because we have collectively used this place, this physical place, to form our national identity. So they kind of short circuit around race and get to this other method. And indigenismo almost doubles down on indigeneity. And it's a really important and interesting contrasting move. And so what I was trying to do is look at how Lawrence moves from one place that does one thing, actually geographically crossing a border into another place,
Right.
and trying to understand a really different political dynamic.
Right.
Sorry to talk so long on
No,
your point, but...
No, I think, I was just curious, like, if he engaged with Vasconcelos' work in any particular way, because I think it'd be like pretty, useful, to like maybe contrast.
Well, people do write about that. Like in Craig Baer's book, that chapter, and I just wrote a review of it for the D.H. Lawrence Review. He is, it's a pretty dense book, truth be told. A lot of academic books are, but he talks about, it's mostly about vanguard intellectuals. Each chapter is about different vanguard intellectuals, so he's talking about who the vanguard intellectuals were in Mexico at the time. Vasconcelos, and how Lawrence, to a certain degree, engaged those ideas, like the bobbed-haired, metropolitan educated women going out into rural communities to educate people, and how Lawrence, kind of maybe represented that in the Plumed Serpent. But from what I understand, he, as I mentioned here, he was very put off that he didn't get to see Vasconcelos himself in person, and that wasn't the way that Lawrence thought a revitalized Mexico should go.
Right.
From my understanding of that. So.
Yeah, because I think Vasconcelos' view of mestizaje is cultural. No, it's a cultural concept. Lawrence saw it in the terms of racial hybridity, and so it was the worst of the mestizos, and that's the representation of Mexico in general in English literature, is the worst of the Aztecs and the Spanish.
He can't get away from race.
And it's a corrupt race.
Yeah.
Right.
He can't get away from race. Like, it's like this addiction for him. He tries to, I'm contradicting what I've said other places, but I do think he puts forth other attempts to offer cohesive context for national peoples to coalesce. He's trying to do that in the Plumed Serpent. But the failure comes as a result of the three people who form this Quetzalcoatl religious trinity. They are essentialized on the basis of race, all three of them. So it doesn't matter that they've come together. They're still defined in these very different ways. And so it's the mestizaje, like it is not represented in what he envisions as this mythical, the counterfactual post-revolutionary Mexico. It just, and he does set up these superior and inferior kinds of people in the novel. He can't imagine this coming together as a national people across all of these different...
And my next question, I think, has to do with that. Well, I'm not a Lawrence scholar. I actually don't work in 20th century literature at all. But, as we were reading your paper, I was reminded, of Kipling somehow, and Kipling being one of the foremost writers of empire, Has Lawrence ever been analyzed with that lens? You know, like because in the 1920s, you know, the British Empire was starting to fall flat, you know, so it was the process. So is he like holding on to, you know, like that maybe romanticization of the past? You know, like I was just maybe curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Been, you know,
yes, yes, absolutely he has. But the thing is, Lawrence himself reckons with his own kind of bodily presence as a kind of colonizing archetype almost. He's this white man from England traveling across on boats and horses and Model Ts and whatever, going into all these places. That is not lost on him.
Right.
He, however, really claimed his working class roots from a coal mining family, from a very, within Britain, like a disenfranchised context. So he thought that, I don't know whether I should say he thought that gave him authority to talk about other kinds of peoples who'd been disenfranchised, but I think he really did believe that he was not a colonial interloper.
Okay.
But that's why he says things like in that essay that I referred to where he says, "Who am I, son of England, to come here and talk about Pueblo tribes?"
Right.
Like he says it out of his mouth because he knows that's what it's going to look like. So, and he can't quite shake. And that's why reading Lawrence is so frustrating sometimes, because you see him wanting to shake certain things that he just can't shake. Like his whiteness, his masculinity, his heterosexuality, although, you know, he does try to establish certain homosocial or homosexual relationships in his works, but he reverts to the things he knows, you know? He would never proclaim to be a Christian, but he is comfortable in, you know, a Christian European context, even though he hates it at the same time.
Right.
So, I mean, but absolutely, I mean, it's not lost on him, and it's not lost on people who work on Lawrence.
Okay.
That's very much what it looks like when he's like, "I want to write a novel on every continent."
Right.
And you're like, "Oh, really? I wonder why you want to
But
do
that could be possible because of the circuits of empire, precisely. That's the whole point of the colonial text.
Yes, yeah. And you know, there are a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are people who do work with post-colonial studies in Lawrence, and I've worked in the like indigenous studies Laurentian interface. I mean, there's a lot more expansion that could be imagined, perhaps, in terms of other ways of reading Lawrence. And in the US, which probably is the case here, and I know it is the case in the UK as well, people aren't like single author specialists anymore. Like you can't be that in modern academia. So people who are like a post-colonial theory specialist might look at Lawrence among many other authors and, you know, and other kinds of contexts. Like I have a colleague at University of New Mexico who's a scholar from India, and she writes about Lawrence as well. So, and actually, so I am the social media coordinator for the D.H. Lawrence Society, so I manage the Facebook account, and I have a grad student from Birmingham who does the Twitter, or X, I guess it's now called, account. But if I look at, on our Facebook page, where our page likers come from, there are so many from, well, there are, actually, since we've gotten going, there are more from Mexico. I can see those numbers change. But from like Pakistan, India, from the Middle East, from Japan. I mean, for somebody who was so obnoxious with his representations of other people, the traction that his work still gets is pretty amazing. So, I'm sure everybody's like tired. Although I've noticed people in Mexico eat dinner very late. So I'm like, I don't know if everybody needs to leave because they're hungry, but I really appreciate you all sitting here, so thank you very much.
Well, thanks for.
No,
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, this is as well, sorry, an invitation to you all for the conference we are organizing. And
In 2025.
2025, August 2025.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last question concerning what you were saying about like no longer working with a single author. But how does a conference that like
That's a
D.H.
great
Lawrence?
I think that's how it happens though. People don't work on single authors in their job at the university, but they may, like Ben Hagen, who is another of the organizers, he's a specialist on Woolf, and so at his university he may teach a seminar on Woolf or a seminar on Lawrence and write an article on them, but most of the time a book, when someone writes a book, it won't be on Lawrence, it'll be like my book was on United States political nativism, and we'll use all of these different authors to make the case. But I would love to go talk with a bunch of other Laurentians about some of these, or a bunch of Woolf scholars, or whatever it is. But I will say that is the only single author conference I go to. The rest of my work, and as is well known, I mean, I work mostly in rhetoric and writing these days. And so, I mean, that's a whole other kind of world. But if I go to like the Modern Language Association conference, the Lawrence Society always has 2 panels at that. That's kind of the last bastion of the kind of single author, like the prominence that used to have. So, but we do get a pretty,
For
pretty
earlier
good
periods, so as a medievalist, like there's a new Chaucer Society, there's 2 Chaucer societies.
Yeah.
And there's the Shakespeare Association of
Yeah,
America. So,
yeah.
like maybe for earlier periods.
Yes, I think so. That remains.
That remains a little.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah. So, but anyway, do consider bringing yourself and your students to the Lawrence Conference in August 2025, and Emma Julieta and I will be filling your email inboxes with information about that. So, and I am teaching or running a workshop in the morning, so if you have any students who are interested in academic writing and beyond, that's what I'll be talking about. So thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.